Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Creative Land Recycling, the California EPA Office, and the Office of Brownfields for the Department of Toxic Substances Control to this webinar. California Tribal Grant Resources for Land Cleanup and Revitalization. Thank you, Tlazoka Matli, for being here today and taking the time to join us so we can go over these opportunities for tribal communities. My name is Natalie Nava, and I am the new program manager with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. If you don't know who the CCLEAR is or the Center for Creative Land Recycling, we are the nonprofit technical assistance provider for both of these grant opportunities. And then today we will be going over, we have Jose Garcia who will be going over the EPA's programs, which some of you may or may not know about. And then Ignacio Davey will also be going over a new program, the ECRG program for the state, which is especially exciting because it is for federally recognized tribes, state recognized tribes, and tribal nonprofits can also apply. And there's a lot of partnerships that can happen too. And so they'll each be presenting and then we'll have question and answers at the end. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll be keeping tabs on them. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time to go over it. It'll be about an hour of presentations and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So now I'd like to hand it over to Jose.
Thank you, Natalie. Get my video going. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for being here. I'm presenting on behalf of Noemi Merrick Ford and myself. She unfortunately couldn't make it because she is not feeling well. But we're going to talk a little bit about US EPA Region 9's Brownfield funding and some of those opportunities. But the main focus of this presentation will be the ECRG funding that's presented by the state. So this is to give another component of funding that might be available. For those that aren't familiar with the brownfields, the federally defined term is real property, so not waterways or bodies of water, for which the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. That's important because property doesn't have to have contamination, known contamination on it to be considered a brownfield. It can have potential contamination, which would necessitate an assessment prior to its reuse or redevelopment. The goal of the Brownfields program is to help these properties that can't be redeveloped get unstuck and get back into some sort of a beneficial reuse that enhances the economic and community needs of the communities where those brownfields are. And we see it as an overlap of environmental issues, economic issues, and then social, community, cultural well-being. Next slide, please. Typical brownfield sites, and we're going to be focused on tribal brown sites that we've seen in tribal communities, can include burned or abandoned buildings, or even buildings that are currently being used but may have asbestos or lead-based paint or regulated building materials in them. Older buildings, leftover or donated buildings. These can be buildings that are also on fee or trust land. Old gas stations and convenience stores, homes where there has been production of illicit or illegal drugs such as methamphetamines, or the use of methamphetamines. We've seen that in several tribal communities. Open dumps where there's hazardous material. This is not an illegal dump cleanup program, but there are some dump sites where hazardous materials have been disposed of, which can qualify as brownfield sites so long as there's a reuse for those sites. And then old feedlots where there may have been dip vats or some sort of chemical pesticide that has been used in those areas. Next slide. Typical contaminants are the universe of hazardous substances, petroleum contamination, regulated building materials, mainly consisting of asbestos or lead-based paint. Again, illegal drug manufacturing. This, we mentioned meth labs, but marijuana farms are oftentimes an issue, especially in some of the more rural tribes. This can be from agrochemicals, mine-scarred land or abandoned mines, and then other contaminants such as biological or animal wastes. The process for brownfields is laid out on this slide, and you can see that the first step in that is identifying the sites and creating some sort of an inventory, a list of potential brownfield sites, and then prioritizing those lists with the sites with the nearest term redevelopment or reuse kind of being at the top of that list, or community concerns. Then you want to focus on planning or redevelopment so that you can identify what the reuse of the site will be. After that, the type of environmental assessment and cleanup that is required will be determined by that assessment in the cleanup plan. The cleanup will occur, and then hopefully that site will lead into redevelopment. And that can be just as you, actually we can, next slide, talk about what that redevelopment can look like, I think. The US EPA's Brownfields program, it can provide both technical assistance and financial support to response programs, environmental assessment, for environmental assessments, cleanups, and redevelopment planning. Next slide. I guess I did omit one slide. Some of the reuse for these sites can include, anything with community benefit, schools, housing, open space, culturally significant space, agricultural, grazing lands, things of that nature. So it's a pretty broad reuse that we consider beneficial. For our FY22 and FY23 funding, we'll be looking at 3 different funding types, which is assessments, cleanups, and multi-purpose grants. Next slide. The assessment grants that we provide are generally the most common ones are community-wide assessments, and there are other ones called coalition assessments, and site-specific assessments. But in general, the funding is meant to establish a brownfields inventory site, conduct environmental site assessments, implement the cleanup and redevelopment planning, not the actual cleanup, but just the planning, and conduct community engagement. A lot of this work is generally done by consultants, but there are some cases where grantees have qualified staff where they can do the work. But the majority of this funding in these grants, 60% or more, should go towards site-specific work for assessment or redevelopment planning. Next slide. Our cleanup grants, they have a couple years ago undergone a change where they have been increased to up to $500,000. You can choose to clean up one site with that, or you can clean up several sites in a target area. All sites that for which you apply to this grant have to have had a phase 2 environmental assessment. Phase 2 assessments are the physical sampling that will show what type of contamination and its extent before you apply for the cleanup grant. The funding can be used for remediation, for planning and confirmation sampling. There is, for the cleanup grants, a 20% cost share requirement, but that can be met in in-kind services such as time, materials, or labor. And those communities that are eligible can apply for a hardship waiver should the 20% match be a little bit more than they can provide. You can also use the funding to conduct community outreach. And you can see some examples of the cleanups. They can be structures, they can be areas where there has been hazardous substances left. It can be abatement of regulated building materials, dig and haul, or even capping and leaving some of the contamination in place when that is the best option. Next slide. The other tool that we have that's competitive is the multi-purpose grants. These are kind of a combination of the assessment and the cleanup grants. The funding can be up to $800,000. You can use it to conduct environmental site assessment, reuse planning, and the remediation of one or more sites. These grants have a little bit longer performance period since it is more work that is to get done with them. It's up to 5 years. The other 2 grants are 3 years. The assessment and cleanup grants are 3-year performance periods. You do have to develop an overall plan for revitalization. The best applications and highest scoring ones are those where there's a redevelopment or reuse plan already in place for that cover the areas where you'd like to get some of this brownfields work completed. Next slide. And then one grant that we have that is very useful. It does take some time to establish a program, is the Environmental Workforce and Workforce Development and Job Training Grants. These grants are meant to recruit and train and then place individuals that are underemployed or unemployed in the target area. They support training in various environmental programs, such as cleanup, assessment work, abatement work, and various different jobs that are related to Brownfields activities. In tribal communities, we have had, as far as I know in our region, I think one, and that was through Northern Arizona University, and they work with the Navajo Nation. There are 4 grantees currently in our region, and if someone would like more information, I'd be happy to connect them with some of those training centers. There are 3 up in the Bay Area, Richmond, Oakland, and San Francisco, and 1 down in Los Angeles. Next slide. Technical assistance tool that we have is our targeted brownfield assessment. This is different than our grant assistance in that recipients don't receive money, they receive the actual technical assistance, which is an assessment on 1 or a couple different pieces of property or buildings. It is a rolling application. It's much less work for to apply for it than competitive grants. It's only a 2-page application that's online. If the site is eligible and selected, we will provide contractor assistance to go out there and do the environmental assessment that's being requested. The applicant will need to be engaged. We will need to do scoping calls with them. They will have to review some of the documents that are generated through that and make themselves available to our consultants and make sure that the property is prepared and there's no solid waste on it before the environmental assessment gets done. It is meant for near-term development. They're generally smaller scales, up to $100,000. With our infrastructure funding, it might be able to do a little bit more than that, but they're generally smaller, and the redevelopment has to serve the public good. Next slide. One other tool that is not competitive is our 128A Tribal Response Program. It is a continuing environmental program. This is a longer term tool that's meant to help develop in a brownfields or emergency response program for tribes. We have about 14 in our region. There is a limit on how much a new grantee can get. It's generally around 60 to 70,000, depending on their needs and the size of their communities. There's no cost share requirement, and it is a good tool for leveraging additional funding later on down the line. Next slide. The first element of the 128A or the Tribal Response Program is that the inventory has to be developed of all the sites. This is an example of what Tohono O'odham Nation developed through theirs. There's a tribe in Southern Arizona where the progress on the assessment and cleanup of those sites is tracked. It is all the information out of the 128A is made available to the public, to your community as well. Next slide. The second element is really the meat of this program, which is to develop oversight enforcement authorities such as rules, regulations, ordinances, laws, things of that nature, penalties as well for illegal dumping or hazardous waste disposal. And it helps ensure that the response actions are adequate to protect human health and the environment. And then it helps to ensure that the response action is completed by providing capacity building and technical training to the staff at the tribe. Next slide. Element 3 is the mechanism and resources for providing meaningful public participation. For all the response actions that take place under this program, there has to be some level of public participation, community input from those tribes that are part of this. We let those tribes develop the most culturally appropriate outreach for their communities, but the information has to be made available to the public and have to have some level of input. Next slide. And the fourth element is approval of cleanup plans and verification. So once a cleanup or response action occurs, how do you know that it is done properly? How do you ensure if there's waste left in place and there's, say, like an institutional control that is being utilized properly, and everyone in the community knows about it. This program helps develop that. Next slide. One example is Elk Valley Rancheria. They entered our program through targeted brownfield assessment, where we did 5 assessments for them. 2 properties rose to the level that required cleanup, and they had near-term redevelopment. They applied for the cleanup grants for those 2 sites a year later. They received those. Both sites have been cleaned up and are currently being converted into open space and recreational space. Later on, they recognized that they needed to enhance and really develop their own brownfields program. So they entered our 128A program, and they have been a recipient or a member of that program since FY17. And they have been very successful and utilized those resources very successfully. So next slide. One other example of what can be developed is in Gila River. They developed the waste management ordinance, which covered household waste, solid wastes, but also hazardous waste, industrial wastes. They delineated what the regulated facilities are and how they should operate. And most importantly, they developed enforcement for those requirements and regulations, including confiscation of vehicles of those found that were doing illegal dumping from on the reservation, but also from people coming off the reservation to dump. Next slide. And then we do have other technical assistance. CClear is a fabulous example of that. We've been working with them for years, and they can offer the assistance that are on the slide there. I won't get into them because they'll probably mention them a little bit later, but one of the most important things they do is help review historical site information, community engagement, and then review grant applications to ensure that they're kind of as best as possible before being submitted. Next slide. And more specifically for tribes, Kansas State University is another technical assistance grantee that helps provide technical assistance. They help develop people's 128A programs, help assess cleanup plans, and help them guide them with contractor selection or development, a request for qualifications or proposals. And they have a wealth of knowledge of brownfield programs in different tribes across the country that they can share with tribes that are interested in entering the program. Next slide. And there's my contact info. The slides will be sent out. I'm also the tribal lead for our Brownfields program in Region 9. So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Jose. So maybe you can answer a couple of questions while I pull up the next presentation.
Sure.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I don't see any in the chat, but we will definitely follow up anyone who signed up with the slides. That was the only question that we got.
All right. Well, can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right, so I'll just go ahead and thank you. Good morning again to everyone for joining us. I'm going, like Jose, I'm going to be going through this rather quickly. Please send your questions in. I'm here to talk about the DTSC, Department of Toxic Substances Control's Equitable Community Revitalization Grant, or ECRG. This is brand new, and it is specifically designed for communities that need deep assistance in reuse and remediation. It's more than $200 million over 3 years, and eligible entities include tribes. And again, it's for impaired and underutilized properties in the most vulnerable communities in order to return these sites to productive use. And this is again under DTSC, which is under the California Environmental Protection Agency. Now, again, a little bit about what CClear does for this. As Jose mentioned, CClear does provide assistance to EPA Brownfields communities. And we have also, under this program, we are what is called a Brownfields Technical Assistance Provider, BTAP, for the ECRG program. And we can help you with one-on-one technical assistance for this, help you figure out if you have a viable project to apply for, and help you become more competitive. And we have set up a special email for this, ecrg@cclr.org. And we also have drop-in, you can, not drop-in, but scheduled technical assistance for tribes that want to consider this, and we can help devise a application for you. So why should tribes apply? Well, first, federally and California recognized tribes are eligible, as well as tribal nonprofits. So that's one difference between ECRG and EPA's program. California recognized tribes are also eligible for this. There's a very streamlined application process. If you apply, you'll find out by May whether you will receive the grant or not. And grants are pretty large. They're eligible expenses up to $7 million. Now, the 100 CES score automatically applied. That I will discuss that later, but tribes do have that advantage from other applicants. And again, it's free technical assistance. We can help you with your application, although you have to prepare your own application. We cannot write the application for you. We can direct you to where you can get assistance, help you get that assistance, and then we can, CCLR can help you make that application more competitive, but we cannot write the grant for you. So funding is available to support three types of projects: a community-wide assessment, a site-specific environmental investigation, and the site-specific environmental cleanup. And you can see the ranges of eligibility for the grants. The applicant must own or have access to the site, and it's a 2-year grant. So that's a very, very tight time frame. But you can apply for the same site if you finish your work early or if you need more work on the site. So for a community-wide assessment, it's to obtain information on the site or a group of sites. So the minimum is 4 sites, and the site here can be identified in different ways. They're usually identified through some kind of assessment number, a partial number, or perhaps the tribe has a different way of identifying their site. That's up to you. So for 4 sites at least, you can do preliminary environmental studies, land use planning studies, and engagement. And the grant range is $80,000 to $300,000. The next type of grant is a site-specific environmental investigation. So this is for one site only. You can conduct an all-appropriate inquiry AAI Phase 1 and other environmental site assessments. And more specific investigations. It can provide some planning activities so you can determine what kind of assessment and cleanup to conduct. And the grant range is $80,000 to $3 million. And the third type of grant is the site-specific environmental cleanup. So this is for cleanup planning and implementing a cleanup activity. It will cover insurance and other environmental activities. And the grant range is $80,000 to $7 million. The key dates. So the grant period opened Monday, March 7, if you need environmental oversight from DTSC. March 7 is the last day to request that. Applications are due on April 4. The June 22, actually May, the end of May, the grant awards will be announced. And if you're successful, we would love to see you at the California Land Recycling Conference in the LA area in June 21 to 24. This is the initial round. There will be additional rounds, grant rounds for this. So again, if you can, it's a 2-year grant, and if you finish your work or if you need more work, you can apply for future rounds as funding is available. So project eligibility for tribes. The site needs to be proposed for tribal reuse. It can be for tribal trust or fee lands. and for sites where the tribe did not materially add to or took measures to prevent additional contamination. Ineligible properties include Superfund sites, federally controlled sites, and sites under a direct order from a California state agency. Now here's a brief timeline. Again, these slides will be made available, so I won't go through this, but we are in the January, we're right in the middle of that chart right now, and look to summer to implementing this. We encourage you to apply, and we have a great team to assist you. There will be eligibility questions, so please ask those very early so that we can resolve those eligibility questions. And anything related to filling out your application and making it competitive, both DTSC and CClear will be available to assist you. So the full application, it's eligible to any organization, and it will cover, these are certain aspects which will make your project more competitive. That you have community participation, that you're consistent with the community plan and the need for brownfields reuse, that you're advanced in your project. So especially if you're going for cleanup, project capacity, having competitive and equitable contracting practices, having a clear budget and make your budget tie in with your work plan and your schedule, and leveraging. The highest ranking applications will be recommended for funding, and DTSC and the applicant will enter into a grant agreement. And that will be after the grants are submitted on April 22. So again, eligibility, I had gone through this before, and the key things I will be discussing are those top three, because those are where tribes would be circumstances where the tribe would be applying under. So scenario one is when the tribal applicant is not the owner. So if the tribe is considering purchasing a site, this would be the scenario that you have to affirm that the applicant did not dispose of any hazardous materials, and that the tribe does not have a direct relationship with that owner, and that the tribe does have access to do phase ones and phase twos on the site. The second instance is when the tribe is the applicant and the owner. So in this case, the tribe just has to assure a DTSC that when it took ownership, that the tribe did not contribute to the contamination on the site, that you fenced it, that you monitored it, and you didn't dump on it. That's the simple way of describing this scenario. The third scenario is for tribal nonprofits, because we're aware that there are tribes that have nonprofits that do business on their behalf. And so in the case of a nonprofit, you also must establish that you're a bona fide purchaser, that you conducted due diligence on the site, and did not contribute to the release on that site. Other site requirements for tribal applicants, again, we because tribes, some tribes do not have, some areas do not have assessors parcel numbers. Please contact CClear or DTSC to be sure that the way you identify a site is something that is acceptable for the grant application, especially for a community-wide assessment. Again, it must meet the definition of a brownfield, and the proposed use must directly benefit the tribe. All the activities must fit within a 2-year time frame. So don't propose anything that you think might take more than 2 years, because DTSC will likely not extend the time frame. So What you can do in 2 years comfortably, that's what you should apply for. And if you have work that you need to get done beyond the 2 years, then you can mention that in the grant application, but don't apply for it. This is a reimbursement program. So it's important that, so what this means is you have to submit an invoice to DTSC, and DTSC will take anywhere from 75 to 90 days to approve and pay those costs. So if this is a concern, please contact DTSC immediately. Or if you have the budget to carry forward those costs and pay them in 30 days and then wait for reimbursement, that can work also. But this is something that may be a consideration for tribes that do not have, that may have cash flow issues. It's important that the investigation and the cleanup work be approved by DTSC or the regulatory agency. There are limited project management costs, so up to 5%, and there are also regulatory oversight costs that are included by this. So whether it's the Water Board, DTSC, or your local agency, and we understand, and DTSC understands that the tribes may have different regulatory oversight arrangements. Please, again, contact DTSC if your circumstance is not covered by number 5. Community-wide assessments. Again, here's an example of eligible costs. You can do inventory of brownfield sites, including GIS mapping. You can do AAI phase 1s and preliminary endangerment assessments. Maybe which is sort of a limited phase 2, and then community engagement and activities. Site-specific investigation. Again, I won't go through this very in any detail because we'd like to leave time for questions, and you will have these slides. One thing I should highlight, though, is that if you have a project that might require CEQA or NEPA, please, again, discuss that with DTSC and with CClear so that we can identify how this will fit into your work plan and how you should submit this information on the application. Site-specific cleanup costs. It can cover pilot tests to design the cleanup, removal action work plans, and equivalent environmental cleanup, including CEQA activities. Here we go. Here we again see CEQA, and we should recognize that there are CEQA or NEPA activities for the reuse, and there are NEPA and CEQA activities for the cleanup activity. These are two distinct activities related to reaching out to your community, letting them know what the potential environmental impacts of a project or a cleanup activity are, and so that you can discuss it and people are prepared for it while you're doing the cleanup and when you do the reuse. Again, this is a bit nuanced, and this is something that CClear can help you with. It will also cover remedial design plans, O&M. O&M plans, it will not pay for long-term O&M. It can pay for institutional controls, both the cost of setting them up and any engineering controls. If you need insurance, it will also pay for that. Activities the grant will not cover, well, it won't pay for the grant preparation. But if you need assistance in grant preparation, let CClear know and we can discuss together what your options would be. It will not pay for costs prior to the approval of the grant. So don't ask for reimbursement of past costs or for work that is not that DTSC has not like work plans that DTSC has not reviewed. Again, long-term operations are not covered, and no penalties or fines. One other thing that EPA does do very well are lead and asbestos surveys and removal. ECRG will not pay for that. So if you need lead and asbestos surveys and or cleanup, then you will have to look elsewhere. There are state grants for that. So ask CClear and EPA if this is the kind of assistance you need. It will not cover building demolition. It will not cover costs to abandon wells or mine features. So if there are adits, mine adits in your location, then it will not pay for that. There are other state grants to pay for that. And unfortunately, it won't pay for food or childcare during public meetings. The terms of conditions, so the DTSC have all these posted on their website, and we had webinars the last 2 days. So we will post in the link, a link to the CClear TV where the videos are available so you can view them, and as well as the DTSC web page where the terms and conditions are located. Please review the terms and conditions because there are some conditions which which tribes may have difficulty meeting or may have issues with. So please look at those and contact DTSC immediately if these are of concern. Now, the applications are filled in online. So this is not a paper activity. Everything is filled up online and you upload documents to the Flux application. And this is already open. You open an account, set up a username, authorize people to help you with an application. You can have more than one application for different sites. So you can't have 2 applications for the same site, but you can submit as many site investigation or site-specific cleanups as you have eligible sites for. And you might have different people assisting you on these applications. So you can authorize people to help you with these applications, and there's a list of documents that you will need to have ready and upload for the application. And again, the last 2 webinars we had go this into very great detail. So thank you. These are the contact. This is contact information for Jose and for myself and for the ECRG. I'm going to stop my share now so people can ask questions and show your camera. We would love to see you and entertain your questions right now. So Natalie? And you're muted, Natalie.
Hi, everyone. I just got one emailed question. I don't see many questions in the chat, but one question that I had gotten over email from a tribal member was, can they apply for multiple pots of money?
Jose, are you there? So for, I guess you can interpret that question in a couple of ways. There are communities that apply both to ECRG and EPA. Now, if you have the same scope of work, make sure you don't double dip. So let's say you hear from EPA first, then use their money. If you hear from ECRG first, use ECRG money. And Jose maybe has a response as well. And but for site specific again, you can again apply for you can apply multiple ECRG, but don't overlap your work plans. So.
Correct. Yes, I mean, there's no prohibition, at least from EPA, of applying for the state funding as well. You do want to, like Ignacio said, be sure that you're not double dipping. Even if you have a tribal response program, the 128A, some of those, for the more established programs, do get site-specific funding as well to do some assessments and cleanups, and that money can be leveraged or layered with ECRG funding. Similar with the cleanup grants as well, they can be layered. They should be, we want to maximize it. So if a site's very contaminated and requires a very high level of cleanup, that would be something that we probably want to talk with Noemi Emerick Ford. She's our Brownfields, our lead coordinator, and she's also the lead in working with the state of California. So she'd be able to take those questions and any kind of specificities related to them and answer those.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention really quickly for any questions for DTSC, I did just put the Tribal Affairs Liaison's email in the chat as well. But I know, Victoria, you had some comments that you wanted to make or question, so please feel free.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions or comments as well too. So, and this is probably more a question for Jose, so when it comes to lead and asbestos, I know in the past I've seen some brownfield assessment money being used to identify the presence of lead or asbestos because they do in fact, fall under that hazardous things. And then I've also seen where brownfield funding could be used to remove a structure in order to create accessibility to soil and groundwater contamination. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because when you look at the regulations and when they're actually and as the program is applied, it can seem very cut and dried. But my own personal experience has been there is room for nuances.
Correct. It's nice seeing you, Vicki. I know we've seen each other at TLEFs in the past. You are correct. Through the EPA funding, lead and asbestos is probably the two of the contaminants that are mostly dealt with through assessments and abatement. So absolutely. With the ECRG funding, because it's state of California funding, they are not allowing that. But as Ignacio said, there's other pots in the state that could address that. So for EPA, the assessment grants, the cleanup grants, the multipurpose grants, and the tribal response program or 128A funding certainly can address those. Same with the targeted brownfield assessments. And for those buildings, you usually get a lot of bang for your buck because compared to other cleanups, the assessment and cleanup costs are generally on the lower end of the scale. On the removal of structures, what we kind of go by is demolition is considered construction, and construction is not allowable under the Brownfields program. However, there are nuances. The one type of construction that I've seen that is, or work that can be considered construction that's allowable is tank assessments and tank removals. In order to properly do an assessment on an underground storage tank, you do have to excavate and remove the tank, assess the soil underneath, and we do not allow for that tank to be put back into the ground. It is disposed of, the hole is backfilled, and the surface level is restored to its previous condition. So if it was pavement, it'll get repaved. If it was dirt, then it'll just get backfilled with dirt. Some structures, in order to assess them or to clean them up, not to really do the assessment, to clean them up, if they are in such a condition where the safety of the workers would be put in harm's way, those structures can be demolished and disposed of if they've tested, positive for lead, asbestos, or contaminants. But that structure has to be in a pretty unstable condition to kind of get there. For other types, I haven't really seen anything, nor have I approved anything where it's kind of the removal of, say, a structure to get under there to remove a tank, something like that. Part of the reason is the construction reason, but also the cost. It'd be very costly to do that, and our grants, they are big, but they're not generally that big. So.
Great, thanks for that clarification. I think that might be beneficial to some folks because it sometimes looks a little weird. The other question I have is relative to tribes applying for this funding. The challenge always is when you apply for funding, particularly if it's coming through a state agency, what responsibility does the tribe have to comply fully with state regulations and then to allow for state oversight? A lot of tribes also receive Brownfield 128 money in which they're developing, establishing and enhancing the capacity to oversee those types of cleanups. What do you envision those roles to look like?
Well, for ECRG, and this came up in one of the webinars, and we have brought this up, is that we understand that Some tribes, they work with the local agency, so the county, what they call the KUPA, and some actually work. They hire their own consultant and confer with EPA. And under those scenarios, at least that were mentioned, DTSC would accept those. But this is a case where, again, because the question will come up in the form, the influx, that contact DTSC right away and say that this is the arrangement you are planning, and that is fine with them. That's a question that you can ask prior to submitting the grant application. So when you're filling out Flux, the way Flux works is that you fill it out, you put in your information, and you can come back to it. You can save it. You can do that for the whole 2 months. And so if you have a question, if you're not sure what document to upload, call them up or call up CClear ASAP so that so whatever you upload is have been and especially for eligibility issues, because there are answers that are more competitive in nature, like they have points, but there are questions that are more yes or no, pass fail. So certainly for the pass fail ones, contact DTSC right away so that and again, especially for any of the terms and conditions that you feel is impinging upon your sovereign immunity. Does that help?
It does. I mean, I actually knew the answer before you answered it, so. But and Jose's thinking, boy, that's really unfair. She asked that question. So then the other question I have about that is, do you know if DTSC would accept a tribe's cleanup standards versus applying the state standards, or only cleaning up to that standard? Because if a tribe has more stringent standards than the state, it might mean that that project's going to cost a little bit more.
If that's what your regulatory agency says, then they'll accept it.
Very good. And then the other question I have is relative to tribal lands that the tribe may have acquired. And let's just say they acquired them before the phase 1 standard was actually developed by ASTM. And then they come to find out later that there was in fact some type of environment on that property that needs to be cleaned up. Does that make a site ineligible then? Because they hadn't performed the due diligence prior to taking title to that.
Well, not just for tribes, but any community that obtained ownership before the AAI requirement came in, generally is not a responsible party, but they should have taken due care not to make it worse when they obtained ownership. And again, I believe tribes are not subject to CERCLA. So tribes have really more opportunities for sites that they do want to reuse.
And
Sure.
Vicky, just kind of building on that, our targeted brownfield assessment, the assessments through the 128A and through the competitive grants can be used to do assessments on properties tribes are considering purchasing or acquiring to ensure that those problems don't happen. And we see that a lot, or we saw it a lot more in the past, but that's an opportunity that can be used through ours program.
Thanks, Jose. And as you're probably aware, there are a lot of nuances in Indian country relative to land and land status and how it's held in trust for those federally recognized tribes, not necessarily for the state recognized tribes. What happens if there's a piece of land that's held in trust that was acquired either before or after the standard was being applied? So it's held in trust now. What where is the engagement with the BIA at that point in time? Because then obviously there may be a BIA action that's potentially triggered. So with the current brownfields configuration, right, you have to do a Section 106 consultation for, historic properties and a cultural clearance and stuff like that. But when it's in trust and the BIA holds title to that, what is the applicability of the tribe actually applying for the funding for that land, even though it's held in trust? They do have full access to it, but there's some potential Department of Interior hook.
If it's held in trust, the tribe is absolutely able to apply for any of our tribal resources, even if it's fee land. And we've seen this with allotments as well. I mean, I'm not a tribal property, real estate expert, so I know there's also different, arrangements for tribal property. BIA, where I've seen them become involved is when they were, to a certain degree, responsible for, say, the leasing of the land for some sort of industrial activity, or even if it's, I've seen old schoolhouses on tribal land that they built that had asbestos containing materials. The tribe generally turns to them first to see if they have any funding for cleanup. That doesn't mean that they can only turn to them, but because our funds are limited, especially through the 128A, we do ask them to check with BIA, and sometimes they can fund that cleanup. If the property is federally owned, however, not trust land, but National Forest, Department of Interior, that type of land, then it would not be eligible. It would not be eligible land for the funding, for our funding. I don't know if that's the case for ECRG funding, but for EPA funding, it would not be eligible. But we do, for those developments where BIA was involved, we do kind of request that the tribe check in with them and see if they can get some funding for that cleanup. There has been cases, though, where I've seen if it's an emergency response action that our OSCs go and do, they will try to cost recover from the responsible party. And I have seen them do that and get cost recovery from it. They obviously consult with the tribe, but our emergency response folks will go and do all that cost recovery work.
Great.
One thing, I'm sorry, about the ownership. Again, ECRG has a bit more latitude in what the tribes can apply for, or even other applicants who may have a use that they are working with the tribe on that has a benefit to the tribe. Now, if they document that, if there's some kind of agreement, then those could also those would prioritize those types of projects, even if the tribe is not the applicant. Now, DTSC, ECRG does not allow state-owned property unless there is a beneficial use to the community, including a tribal use. So again, there's some more latitude there, but for instances like that where it's a unique situation, always ask early, so that because the DTSC staff have to check with their legal counsel, make sure that it's something that they can pay for. And one other thing I mentioned in the presentation, but I did not clarify, is the CES score. The Flux application will ask for an address or a location of the site and of the tribe, and that is used to generate a Cal Enviro Screen score. Now, for tribes that have properties on urban, where they're in urban areas or even rural areas that have the Cal Enviro screen, then it will generate a score. And some tribal areas do not have a CES score. Whether you're one or the other, you get a 100 automatically. So there are some rural areas, that that the tribe may own land that has a CES score of 50 or 30 or 20. It doesn't matter. It'll get 100. So that's one reason why a tribe should consider applying.
I have two more questions if no one else has a question.
No one else has asked a question, and I'll ask again after.
I think you're reading everyone's minds, Victoria.
Yeah. Thank you, Victoria, for going over all these nuances.
Well, I've been around a while. Another question I have is, so let's just say there's a piece of land within the footprint of the tribe's lands that were defined in treaty, but the tribe doesn't own it, and it's contaminated, or there's an abandoned owner, a missing owner. Is a piece of property like that eligible? And then one last question, and then I'll shut up, because I'll let you answer them both at the same time. One of the other challenges that I've heard from tribes is in usual and customary use areas, ancestral grounds, where they're able to hunt and fish according to treaty or what have you. When they come across contaminated lands, there's an interest in restoring those lands, right? And I'm just going to take out that maybe they're not owned by the National Forest or BLM or anything like that. But those usual and customary use lands, I know that's something on the national stage we're really pushing EPA headquarters to try to look at is, we want to be able to clean up some of these, customary lands, because those are important. That's the lifestyle. And so that's two questions, right? What's about a piece of land not owned by the tribe within the reservation or the rancheria? And what's about usual and customary use places? Now I'll shut up.
I can take those. For the pieces of property that are not in trust or in fee or owned by a tribe, they can, if the tribe is interested in acquiring them, they can use our funding to go out there and do assessments, acquire it, and then clean it up. However, they would need to gain access from that property owner or consent to be able to do the assessment prior to purchase and then the cleanup. If that landlord is absent, then it probably wouldn't be able to get that consent, so you couldn't use the funding on it. We've seen this, and the most complicated cases are where the property owner passed away. They had 6 kids, and all 6 of them got a piece of the land, and you have to consult with each one of those now property owners and get their consent to an access agreement to be able to get on there. But if it's an isolated piece of land and it's not really worth anything, or it's more hassle to them than they care to deal with, usually that's they will grant that. It's tracking them down that's the hard part. The tribe cannot just go in and do the cleanup, even if it has been traditional lands, if it's not part of that legally defined trust or fee land. For the other customary uses, the same thing applies if it's not owned. If they're interested in acquiring, yes, you can do the assessment with an access agreement and consent, and then purchase and then do cleanup. However, if the property is owned by an eligible entity, say a nonprofit of some sort, a unit of government, and there has been hazardous substances or petroleum-based substances, there is a possibility that an assessment can be done on the site through various ways. We have ways to get around some of the responsibility requirements, and that a site can be assessed. It won't, if they're responsible, if they allowed the dumping to happen or contamination to happen, they probably wouldn't be eligible for the cleanup funding. But if the tribe were to acquire it, then the tribe would be eligible for the cleanup funding, right? So assessment would be doable, cleanup's a little more complicated. Those are great questions, though. Really hone into the specific nature of the needs of tribes and the concerns. So thank you.
I don't think the answers would be any different for ECRG, and we'd probably refer them all to the tribal affairs anyway. So.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for all those wonderful questions. I just wanted to give a chance to anybody else who would like to ask a question.
Do you have a poll, or is it too late for a poll?
No, we have a poll as well. So we really appreciate your participation. I don't see any other questions. So yeah, Rachel, if you could launch the poll. Oh, it's saying the poll is inactive.
Yeah, I'm getting the same message. I'm not sure what's up with that. Does anyone have access to launch the poll? Can you check?
Nope, not me.
I don't.
Well, I guess we'll have to do without the poll.
Yeah, we were just going to ask, what types of funding you all were considering applying for. But I think, in summary, just reach out to us if you need any assistance, and we hope that you consider applying.
Great.
Well, with that, Natalie?
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I think that we are done. Please, don't hesitate to reach out to CClear as well as DTSC Tribal Affairs Office and to EPA with any questions. And we're here to support you all in your successful application. So thank you for joining us today.
Bye.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank yous. Okay, good. There were some people there. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for putting stuff on the chat.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.